The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
And the saint we're going to begin discussing today is Saint Anselm. And we know him as Saint Anselm of Canterbury. Let's talk about the times that he lived and what might have been significant at that time before we get in some specifics about Anselm.
Well, he lives during the 11th century, just briefly into the 12th century. Born in 1033 and dies in 1109. As you mentioned, becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury. So for those that don't know where that is located, it is within England. England at this time is still a Catholic country. The whole Henry VIII events have not happened. But we're also in the midst of, or a Christian country, because we're in the midst of an event. His life is separated by a date that every English child learns, like we here in the United States, we know about 1776, and we might know some of the other dates of different things that happen. Every British child learns 1066, the Norman Conquest. And so there is war, there's division, there's acquisitions of land and property, and the whole aspect, between France and what becomes Great Britain is happening at that time. There is a noble structure that is in place. We have had kings and queens of England for some time now, and his family is part of that structure.
What's interesting is that he is a Benedictine monk, and yet this Benedictine monk becomes a very public figure as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And that would be rather different, don't you think? Because as a Benedictine monk, he would have lived a life of a cloister. He would have spent most of his time, if not all of his time, in work and in prayer. And so here he is called to lead the Church of England during this particular time. He's also considered a philosopher and the founder of scholasticism. So obviously he is a knowledgeable person. He understands not only the ways of the faith, but he understands how the world works. He's a very astute person. He, like many of people across the ages, was declared a doctor of the Church. We've talked about that whole sense of being declared a doctor of the Church. Let's briefly explain that sense again. It's not a medical doctor.
No. Well, again, it is a designation given by the Holy See to particular saints, and for the longest period in the history of the Church, male saints. I think 1970 is when we see the first female doctors of the Church emerge, and we have people like Teresa of Lisieux and Teresa of Avila, a few others that become doctors of the Church. But it is their writings, their teaching, that gives a greater and deeper insight into how we live our faith. Not necessarily that their writings are so scholastic. We talk about him being very astute and involved in scholastic endeavors, but that they speak to the heart, they speak to the mind, and they illumine the path that will lead us ever closer to Christ. It is interesting to note, though, I believe from his noble birth and being part of a noble system, there would have been this higher academic standard already in place for him. I mean, we don't have the structures of academia that we have now during the 11th century, but he would have received the best of education that was known at that point. And so he had the foundation and the underpinnings to continue to build on. And we see that that might be what elevated him out of his role as a monk into this leadership role in the Church, because there wouldn't have been that many. Even though you would have received training, and you would have been given knowledge and understanding of the church, he might have started with a good learning curve in coming to all of that.
What's interesting is that even though he ascends to this prelature as the Archbishop of Canterbury, he still maintains his whole sense of following the rule of Benedict. He lives his life in the Benedictine rule, a faith-seeking understanding, and as a scholastic, as a philosopher, that would have been something that he would have done on a daily basis, is understanding the faith by deepening your knowledge of the world around you. And so, oftentimes, I've thought of this many times as a priest, that, when we were taught at a young age about the truths of the faith, oftentimes we were taught things without really understanding why we learned what we learned, and how important it is nowadays to be able to say, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe what I believe. And so there's that whole sense that we continue, not just the Benedictine rule, but we continue to grow in faith with our understanding of the world around us, and how important that knowledge is in developing one's faith. We've got a few minutes left in our first segment. Any correlation with Anselm and other saints in the Church of England at all?
Well, there's a direct connection between another saint who will be canonized later, or actually martyred, and that would be Thomas à Becket, who becomes the Archbishop of Canterbury in the 12th century. And he would be a successor who champions the cause of one of his predecessors. And we've spoken a little bit before about Thomas à Becket, and just briefly his whole story of he did not become the Archbishop of Canterbury for the best of motives. He didn't have the background or training. He actually was put in place to be a stooge of the king, and yet he grows and develops in his own faithfulness. And so you have to believe that he looked to someone like Anselm as his guiding force as he grew in his faith and grew in his understanding not only of who he was called to be as Archbishop of Canterbury, but the great responsibility he had in helping to form and shape the hearts and minds of the Catholic people under his care. And so you see Thomas à Becket not only look to him as a guiding force, but champion his sainthood cause.
What's interesting also is that we've talked oftentimes in this particular segment of growing deeper in one's knowledge of God and the world and so forth. How important it is for us to grow in that knowledge of God, but to understand that that very gift itself comes from the gift of God, and how it's important for us as we grow in that knowledge of God, we grow in that understanding who God is for us. And that's really the important part of the Christian faith, is to understand who Jesus is for me, who God is in my life, how he rules and directs that. And as we grow in that deeper knowledge and love of God, we obviously grow closer to the Lord, to his church, to his body, and we become even more perfect members of the body of Christ. We're going to talk about another saint in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. So please stay with us. We'll be right back.
There is a place where a total stranger will give you their blood. A place where someone you never knew will save your child from drowning. Where a person who doesn't look like you, talk like you, or dress like you will give you shelter after a flood. That place is called America, where we look out for each other. When you help the American Red Cross, you help America.
My name is Sister Mary Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. And I remember when one of my cousins got sick, and she called my mom and said, "Mom, the doctor has said that I might not have too long to live. Will you please raise my 3 children for me?" I remember we had a meeting at home, and my dad called a meeting, and my mom was explaining to all of us And my father said, this powerful word, he said, we already have 8. What is 3 more? We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, to make up, to forgive, to just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to share that with children who do not have that love and that opportunity just to know what a family is all about.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. The saint we're going to discuss now is St. George. Oftentimes when we think of St. George, we think of this mythological figure, this moniker of a dragon slayer. We'll talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to his life. But before we do that, let's kind of set the stage and let the folks know when he was born. What time did he live?
Well, he's born in 275 and dies in 303, so he lives a short life. He doesn't make it even to the age of 30. But during that period of time, that wouldn't be necessarily short life, except his life was cut short by martyrdom. He is a soldier in the Roman army. We've talked about a few other soldiers in the Roman army and how that martyrdom might have come about. We've talked about the conversion of faith that comes about. We see that role of you are persecuting, perhaps are being called upon to kill other Christians who will not renounce their faith in Jesus or refuse to espouse the beliefs and views of this newfound Lord and to be part of this newfound religious sect. But again, those moments of conversion, when you're the one persecuting and you're the one taking people's lives, and yet there is not hostility or violence met, but there is peace and comfort and joy in this relationship with the Lord, it has a profound effect on certain people's lives. We saw it with St. Sebastian, and we see it with George.
What's interesting also is that George's parents are Christians of Greek origin, and it's rather odd that someone whose parents are Christians would find themselves in this particular profession, because I think we've spoke before about how as a member of the army, as a soldier in this day and in that day and age, it would have been typical for you to kill somebody because flesh was very cheap at that time. And so that whole sense that as a Christian, he joins this profession that was anything but being a Christian. And yet, through this profession, he used it to bring about the kingdom of God. And we see that in his relationship with non-Christians. We see that in his relationship with other Christians and with other people. And so there's this whole sense that as a soldier, he continued to live and practice his faith, even though those who controlled the army tried to get him to denounce his faith. And he was steadfast in that and retained that faith until his death.
Well, and we don't know exactly what the motives might have been for him to become a soldier. But we've talked about vocations in the church, but we also have to acknowledge people's vocations in what they do for a living, the occupation, the job that they feel called to. And so there obviously was something about George that he felt called to this life of service. And while it is a hallmark of any period of time that if you're in the military, you may be called upon to take another person's life in battle. It certainly would have been true of the time that George becomes a soldier. But we also have to think of soldiers and the army protecting citizenry. Maybe he physically was gifted with the ability to be a soldier. Maybe his mind was oriented toward that. There could have been other people in his family, that were of that profession. We see a lot of people in the military. They might be inspired by a parent or an aunt or an uncle, or a grandfather that was in the military. So for whatever reason, and this could have created some angst and some turmoil for him. He feels called to a profession that then is seeking to destroy who he is. and create some inner turmoil and angst. But he had to make a decision which, and he would not renounce his faith. And so then the irony is soldiers of his own ranks would have been called upon to take his life.
Let's talk about St. George as the dragon slayer. You know, we mentioned that initially in the segment. Symbolically, the dragon would have been akin to invading armies. And so as a soldier, his command would have been to slay invading armies, whether it was in the country that he was protecting or the people that he was protecting. And so this kind of myth grows in the life of St. George, that he is a dragon slayer. He is the one who truly eliminates the enemy. And if we could put that in a symbolic way with his life and also in the celebration of his faith, is that he withstood the enemy, which was evil, which was those who told him and commanded him to denounce his faith. And he stood up to that. And so there's this whole sense that his own life was symbolic of the myth that was attached to him. There's also interesting note that he was very, maybe not influential, but related well to the Muslim community. And what does that maybe say to us in this day and age?
Well, we'll take the first part. Certainly we see the symbolism that while the dragon would represent invading armies, and he as a soldier would have to defend the country, we also see that the dragon represents those forces that would seek to destroy our faith, that would seek to have us denounce Jesus. And so it's not so much we use the symbolism of him slain, and we see him in armor, and we see him with the great sword and the dragon slain and laid to waste. But it is that we must be victorious over those forces that would seek to destroy the faith that we have within us. So that deals with that aspect of the symbolism of the dragon and the soldier and all of that. His respect, or whatever it was, tolerance of the Muslim people, we certainly see that as a people of faith, we are called to respect all other people. It doesn't mean that we abandon our religious values. It doesn't mean that we, having respect and reverence and dignity for other people, even in their differences. It says more about how that life of Christ has affected us. We're not taking on their way of life. We're not taking on, their religious views. It doesn't weaken or water down ours. We stand victorious in our own faith and our own relationship with the Lord, but our relationship with the Lord should not have us wanting to see people who have other expressions of faith. Now, I'm not talking about people who pervert that faith, but people who have a relationship with the Lord that might be exhibited differently than ours, but one that is still built on peace and love and respect of others, should be respected. And George would be an example of how we're called to do that.
And we celebrate his feast on April 23rd. We've got one more saint for you. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
I spent 34 years as a teacher.
I just loved interacting with the students.
Many sisters, brothers, and religious order priests served for little pay, and now their communities lack retirement funds.
My very first class had 56 first graders.
Gifts to the Retirement Fund for Religious help provide for medications, nursing care, and more. Please give to those who have given a lifetime. Donate at your local parish.
God bless you for your help.
By the time we can walk, each of us yearns for the joy that comes from being able to do for ourselves. Church World Service believes that being self-reliant is a joy everyone should share. So around the block or around the world, share the joy. Church World Service.
Welcome back to our show. We're going to now talk about Saint Adalbert. We just finished talking about St. George, whose feast is on April 23rd. St. Adalbert also shares the same feast day as St. George. I would venture to say that most celebrants like I think we spoke about St. Blaise and St. Ansgar, would choose one over the other. Oftentimes this would probably be the same case. But let's try to share some information on Adalbert that might allow the folks that are with us not only to get to know him more, but perhaps to want to get to know more about him. Anything in particular we'd like to start with?
Well, I think one of the things that perhaps becomes the first thing that people look at in a saint, aside, I hope, from their life of holiness, is a connection. And so when we look at Adalbert, we see that he is from Prague, Bohemia. And so for the people of the Czech Republic, for the people of that region, Adalbert would first and foremost be someone they would want to learn a little bit more about. Perhaps there are other saints of that region they know more about. We've talked about saints too, and the canonization process, and those who, people are crying out for sainthood now. It's interesting to note that he's born in 956 and dies in 997, but is declared or canonized in 999, so just 2 years later. Now, there is martyrdom involved in that, but it's interesting that there is actually a declaration that he becomes a saint, and it's very quickly after his murder and martyrdom in the church.
What's also interesting is that, we've talked about this before, about how one grows up in a particular town or village or country, and then returns to that same town or village as a prelate or as a leader within the church. And so we see Adalbert of Prague celebrating his life as the successor of the deceased Bishop of Prague. And he receives this at a very young age. And it could be because he is from royal lineage, that he would have been schooled in the faith, would have been have a deeper understanding of history of the world, of scholasticism, and so he continues at a very young age the life and the mission of this deceased Bishop of Prague. What's also interesting is that he founds the first monastery there. And, we've talked about monastic life again, but as Bishop of Prague, he would not have lived a monastic life. And yet he begins this monastery there to call others to that particular monastic rule. What do you think might have been behind something like that to initiate that institution?
Well, when we look deeper at Adalbert's life, there had to have been a self-desire for that type of life. We know that he's part of royal lineage. We know that he's part of a court system. We know that he's ordained at around the age of 25, and then, as you said, quickly thrown into the role of bishop. And yet, perhaps in his own reflection, in his own, self-discovery, that monastic life, that simplicity, is something that speaks to him. And so sometimes a good parent wants to provide for their children what they themselves did not experience. And so he feels that maybe there are others that would really be touched by this particular relationship with the Lord. And so he develops a monastery. Why I talk about that train of thought in this is that he eventually goes and lives as a hermit. And so there is this rejection of the whole style of living and life that he's called to. Not a rejection of his faith, but a rejection of the public living, the life of nobility, the life of a bishop, the life of the public figure. And in towns and regions that we're talking about in this time period, the bishop would have also been kind of like a parallel figure of royalty. They would have been someone that people went to with needs and would have ruled in their own way. And even, we don't know specifically with Adalbert, but we know that we often refer to the cardinals of the church as the princes of the church. And so how did that structure develop? It patterns itself after court life, but it patterns itself after the fact that, we'll hear about an heir and a spare. Well, a lot of the cardinals of churches in very Catholic countries, when we talk about the king working with the Pope or with Rome to appoint them, we find sometimes third and fourth and fifth sons would become clerics would become bishops and then would be elevated to an archbishop or a cardinal. And so we see that court system. And so there is that duality of the church and court life going on. There seems to have been a rejection of that in Adalbert's life.
What's also interesting is that there's kind of a progression in his life. He's born into royalty. He likes the monastic life, and yet he succeeds the deceased Bishop of Prague in this very well-known prelature. Then he creates this monastery because, as you had mentioned, there's something within him that likes this monastic life. But then we see him go on to become a missionary himself, and then eventually become a hermit. And so there's this progression from royalty to seclusion. There's this whole sense from being of the world to being apart from the world. So there's that whole sense that, isn't that really part of the gospel message, I believe, in John's gospel? You are of the world, but you're not to be really part of it. You're to stand apart from it. And so there's this whole sense that Adalbert, in his own life, stood apart from it because of who he was and because of his understanding and the knowledge of his faith. In the last few minutes of our time in this show, let's talk about a significant celebration that took place 1,000 years after his death.
What is it? Interesting. We talked about his feast day being April 23rd. We've talked about most feast days are the day you died. And so we know that his martyrdom was April 23rd of the year 997, on the 1,000th anniversary of his martyrdom. And to think 1,000 years later to have such a celebration. There was a commemoration in the Czech Republic, in Russia, in Germany, in Poland, in places that he had served and had patronage of. And it was our late Holy Father, Pope St. John Paul II, who visited his tomb and celebrated a Mass there with over 1 million pilgrims. So 1,000 years later, 1 million pilgrims. And we began our segment by saying he's probably the alternative choice on his feast day. But on his feast day in 1997, 1 million people turned out to commemorate a 1,000-year legacy. And so maybe next year or later this year, we need to take a look at whether it's George or Adalbert and invite that life of royalty, that life of church service, but also that life that invites us, even in secluded moments, to find that interior relationship with the Lord and then share it with others.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.